Hey guys, welcome back to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. I'm really excited to be able to share some more material with you guys. I apologize for the long delay. We had 3 episodes that we recorded but weren't able to get out as I've had to try and create a workflow around getting this podcast done while also being on the road a lot. I was right after I recorded these episodes, I was in Australia and China for 4 weeks, which was great, and I got home and it was time to really focus on the development of the big summer seminars, which we just finished the first of, which is the Hero's Journey, which was our first intermediate advanced event and went really well. We had some great athletes from all over the country. We spent 8 days in nature exploring some of the most incredible terrain and doing things that I think blew the minds of almost everyone present, where they were able to kind of overcome themselves and face down fears in a way that was really powerful and to share just amazing moments. So really excited about that event. Had a really great time myself and enjoyed being with these guys. We've got the Return to the Source coming up August 3rd. That's just less than a week and a half away, and that's going to be amazing as well. We've got a really great crowd coming from all over the world, and it's going to be another beautiful experience out in nature. So in any event, that's been taking up my time, and I've been trying to figure out what to do with this podcast, but I wanted to get these out, so we're going to just do a couple things. Well, one thing I wanted to mention before I move on is, in order to get these podcasts out, the problem with getting these podcasts out is right now I'm doing them for free. I don't have advertising, and I don't want to have advertising. So what I've decided to do is start a Patreon where you can support the podcast, but also, we'll be developing lots of other free content as far as articles and tutorials to help support your natural movement practice. So if you could drop us a review on iTunes and go over to Patreon and start pledging even a small amount to help support these podcasts, it'll make it much easier for us to get out and really have these amazing conversations and share them with you guys. So I will link our Patreon in the show notes, and please go ahead and support that. Our first episode is with my friend Mark Walsh. Mark is an embodiment teacher with a background in Aikido and yoga, who teaches embodiment principles for leadership and embodied yoga and has taught in many places all over the world. Very interesting guy, really interesting conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get us into that interview. So enjoy. Welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. Today, my guest is Mark Walsh. Mark Walsh is a leader in the field of embodiment. He invited me on his podcast recently, and we've become good friends going back and forth because we share a lot of common interests. Super interesting guy. Embodiment's actually a field that I don't know a lot about, which is one of the reasons why I really wanted to have Mark on, because I feel like it's something that's going to be very interesting to the whole audience. I know that you teach embodied workshops for leadership, embodied workshops for yoga. You teach embodied yoga principles. And you're also heavily influenced by martial arts. So if you could just start by telling us what embodiment is and and why we in the movement community might be interested in it, that would be a really good place to start.
Sure, that'll take us about an hour. So
Perfect.
Nice to see you again, man. One of my favorite people to talk with. So what is embodiment? The idea here is the body can be seen as a piece of meat, as an object, as a thing. This is kind of how generally the medical profession or the modern fitness industry would view the body. That's one way of viewing the body. The body is it. An embodied, or we could say somatic perspective, is the body is part of us. It's part of our being. It's part of our self. It's part of who we are. It's a substrate for how we think, how we feel, how we live. The idea here, as my colleague says, is the body is more than a brain taxi. You could also look at it as in 2 other ways. One would be as a kind of intelligence. So embodied intelligence, going beyond just kinesthetic intelligence, but incorporating emotional intelligence, intuitive intelligence, as a way of activating other kinds of intelligence. Another way to look at it would be the overall term where all the kind of body-mind fields come together. So dance, martial arts, body therapy, body work, theater, yoga, these things all share a lot, and they all have something to say about being human, as you know. And there kind of needs to be a term which is an overall term for those, which differentiates them from a purely body approach, this body as object rather than part of self. So that is my first take today, and this is the bane of my life on as in terms of what embodiment is. How does that land?
That, yeah, it makes sense. It's sort of like there's this popularization of the idea of a movement culture, which is a culture or a training practice that tries to unite, like a tent, basically, that unites things that are oriented towards movement. As I look at movement as opposed to fitness, right? Where the output of the training is about the skills that are acquired and the capacities that you develop, not about, the way the body looks or the way that or some arbitrary markers of fitness, right? VO2 max or whatever it is. That's how I kind of differentiate the movement world from the fitness world. And so when you describe embodiment, it's like, it's very similar, but the emphasis is in how the body and mind are connected in one thing, and getting people to step out of, in some sense, that Cartesian dualism.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of two criteria for me, like in a way, you say you don't know about this, you do. Actually, I know your work is definitely embodied work, or at least proto-embodied work, and we see across the movement world. I've become fascinated with the movement world because I've seen this move away from this purely objectified kind of fitness, body as machine mentality, to something a little more creative, a little more holistic. So I think it's on the tip of the tongue for members of your community, and certainly people like yourself or the Fighting Monkey guys, whoever, they're deep in it. I regard as embodiment practitioners, even if they don't use the word. So that the key things for me is A, it's mindfulness based, so it's feeling based, it's not just doing, and B, that it's working at the level of self. So I mean, in that sense, surfing could be an embodied practice, or gardening, or anything else. However, there tends to be certain traditions like the martial arts, which are, that's explicit in any traditional Japanese martial art, is a do, is a practice, is a way of being, a path, as well as simply a physical or a movement art. So I feel like this is on the tip of everyone's tongue, kind of more in your world. And I think it's really exciting cross-fertilization, because I've been getting more into the sort of movement culture, the movement out, all this kind of stuff, and finding it really interesting, and loads of great psychological exercises in this. And certainly when I hear about you talking about, say, climbing trees and the kind of challenges of that, I'm like, okay, this guy, yeah, he's doing movement, but he's also working on himself. That's the key thing for me here.
Yeah, there's a saying that comes out of the mountaineering community, which has always kind of captured what I'm really trying to do, which is, it's not what the man does to the mountain, it's what the mountain does to the man.
Yeah, certainly the sort of extreme sports and the outward, I worked in outward bound myself for a few years. That community has also sort of discovered a lot of this stuff, and they don't necessarily have kind of systems for it, for developing it more systematically, more rigorously, as some of the sort of Asian arts, or all the Western psychological arts, because there's Western traditions of, say, theater or dance movement or body psychotherapy, which are really sophisticated in terms of the models and how they understand these things. But if you're doing anything with the body and intensity and passion, you're just going to stumble across this stuff. So I can very easily have a conversation with, say, a climber or a, extreme BMXer or something like that, and have really good common ground with them.
Yeah. So it's interesting, because the word embodiment, I feel like, is something that I'm using more, and hearing more coaches talk about. I'm very interested in the idea that, as your friend said, the body is more than just a brain taxi. I've been digging into the neurological research, and there's this recognition all of a sudden that the brain is one part of the nervous system, and that the nervous system extends all through the tissues, and that a huge proportion of our nervous tissue is not in the brain itself. A lot of it's in the gut, in the enteric nervous system, and then a lot of it's in the body, in the spine. So there's this idea that we could just kind of like get a brain, we could transplant our brain into another person, and that would just become us, in a sense. And it might become a lot of us. It'd carry our narrative self in it, but we'd be missing a huge component of what that brain interacted with. And I think that there's that realization is profound in understanding who we are, what we are. And so it's something that I'm thinking about a lot. And not only that, the other layer to that is that you have, so one, the nervous system goes throughout the body, but the other is that the thinking part of the nervous system itself, that part of you that tells the story of who you are, is actually a really small component even of the brain. And that most of the rest of the brain is about controlling the body.
Yeah. So, this sort of science fiction fantasy, we can download or upload our brains, ourselves through this, like it was all just information, is completely false. And actually people working in the field of robotics actually study embodiment as well, because to make realistic robots, they need bodies. It's quite interesting. There's certainly a lot of research out there that's come in, but even in the sort of 10 years I've been running a company, it's really kind of made things easier to present, like when I'm in the business world, to present this stuff. I don't want to get into the business of sort of neurobunk or kind of the appeal to authority of neuroscience, but this certainly, some suggestive stuff, as well as, research by people like Amy Cuddy or the guy called the Dance Doctor at Hertfordshire University in the UK. These people have really shown what anyone who's been working with the body experientially for a long time has already discovered. It can help sometimes to present that kind of research to people, but I'm very much of the experiential ilk. So, I just put it out there, anyone listening, when you're in a good mood, doesn't the world look different? When you're in a place which affects your embodiment, whether it's in a forest or walking into a cathedral or in a busy city like New York or Moscow, doesn't that affect how you are? This is experientially something we can have a sense of, and then people studying it more rigorously as well. In some ways it's kind of common sense, and it can be refined to be more of a useful kind of practice. And we all have some sense that our practice is kind of a key part here, that our practices are affecting us. If you do 10 years of martial arts or 20 years of dance, I don't think anyone's going to say this doesn't affect me as a person. That would be crazy. But it can certainly be made much more efficient and much more conscious in terms of how that might affect you.
Yeah. So just to kind of like play back what I hear you saying, embodiment is a practice, or maybe a series of, or a set of practices that that are movement based in a sense, but that are oriented not towards the output of skill so much as they're oriented towards the development of self-cultivation in the connection between the mind and the body. And is that a good way to describe what you guys are doing?
That's a nice way of putting it. I like how you put it there. Another one would be to say that the body is just involved with more than is commonly thought. So cognition, perception, emotion, relationships, politics, spirituality, all these different areas are embodied phenomena.
Absolutely. So then the embodiment world as it currently sort of exists. In our previous conversations, we've talked about the idea that it primarily comes from sort of three primary lineages, or maybe four.
Six, I usually count. Yeah.
Okay, 6. So can you give us the 6 kind of primary lineages that have given rise to this field?
Sure. Maybe prior to that, the question for anyone listening is like, so what? Because I didn't actually answer that second question.
Okay, cool.
And I kind of feel like I want people to be like, I have some skin in the game here to be like, okay, this is why this might matter to me before I kind of lay out the territory. And the answer there would be is like, okay, we're all practicing. Like right now, how you're sitting is affecting you, both in the short term in terms of state, but eventually long term in terms of being. How you're walking down the street, if you're listening to this on your iPhone or whatever, walking down the street, we're embodied in place. So how is the place you are affecting you right now? The relationship, like we have a friendship developing. So that's quite different in my embodiment than if I was being interviewed by, I don't know, my sister or my mom or a random stranger, So, yeah, right. That would be fun. Maybe on Channel 4. I'm not sure I'd keep so calm. you know, there's cultural tendencies, you know, like I'm from an Irish background, but I grew up in England. I've spent a lot of time in both Russia and Brazil, for example. There's a cultural mix there. And knowing, the first thing is like awareness, right? Like knowing what's going on with all these factors that we've just laid out. And then how is that affecting you? It's the first thing. Second thing is like, what are you practicing? How are you developing yourself? Like most people, I guess, who listen to this are doing some movement practice. So to know how that's developing you or not as a person, I think is really interesting. And then you get a lot more bang for your buck when you get an embodied perspective. It's like Intel inside, you know, you can add this to anything you're doing. You can still lift weights at the gym. You can still climb trees. You can still run through the canyons or whatever cool shit is in your videos these days, you know? And it's like, but there's this new perspective of, okay, what am I working on as a person here? How am I developing myself in ways that are going to show up with my kids? Not just I can physically get down on the floor and squat with my kids, which is great, right? Mm-hmm. But also, like, how is this affecting my level of playfulness or seriousness? Or, you know, how is this affecting my marriage? How is this affecting me in the workplace? Beyond just the kind of health narrative, which is super useful, and I do stuff for health, but there's way more here. So I just want to kind of tantalizingly dangle that for anyone who's listening and say, this can enrich whatever the hell it is you're doing, add awareness to it, and add just so many new possibilities.
So what I kind of hear there is, if you take this embodied perspective, you can basically gain an ability to steer the kind of development of your character personality in ways that are going to positively affect your I want to say affect, which is probably a really scientific way of saying
affect, cognition, relationships. I mean, you got kind of half of it. So it's awareness and choice on 2 time frames. So awareness is like, what am I doing? And right in the moment, but also on the time frame of my life, like, who am I? And choice in terms of like state regulation. Yeah. Like we had some problems, didn't we, on getting the call set up?
Yeah.
You know, we're both getting frustrated, and then I'm like, okay, relax the belly. You know, with that awareness, like, how do I actually want to be on this call right now with you? Mm-hmm. And then, you know, over the longer time frame, how we develop ourselves, which includes affect, but also cognition, relationship, all these other things.
Cool. So what does that look like? Like, just give me a breakdown on, like, if you're taking an embodied perspective into a movement practice, how would that be distinct from just a movement practice that doesn't have that perspective?
I think the first thing is there's a different awareness there in terms of, okay, I'm aware that I'm working with myself and not just meat. You know? The second thing is different intention. So, you know, it's like the old story of the 3 guys building the wall, you know, this one, and there's 3 guys laying brick, and someone comes up to the first one and says, what are you doing? And he's like, well, I'm building, you know, I'm just putting bricks on top of each other. And the second guy, and he says, well, I'm making a wall. You know, and that there's a difference in his motivation, and, you know, even though it looks the same activity from the outside. And the third one, he says, what are you doing? He says, oh, well, I'm building a cathedral for the glory of God. And that's an entirely different perspective, even though all 3 of them are laying brick. It's a story I got from a guy called Strozzi, who's a big name in this field. It's a pretty common story in a number of fields. And you'll still be lifting the weights or doing the running or fighting or wrestling or whatever you're doing, but there's an entirely different, for the sake of what, entirely different perspective behind that in terms of why you're doing that. And it just leads you to make different choices as well, I think. So aside from just the motivation there, which for me is just much more interesting. Yeah. You know, I mean, I do some stretches just purely because I'm trying to, I don't know, align my pelvis, or do some physical thing, lengthen my hamstrings, and that takes me a certain amount of interest. But when I'm doing my stretching with the sense of, like, okay, how am I learning to surrender? Or how am I learning to push my edge? That for me is just way more interesting. And also, as I said, it guides the decisions you'll be making as to what your practice is. You know, does that support the things you love? So don't waste your fucking time, right? That's the key thing for me here. Is it okay to swear on this podcast, by the way?
Sure.
We're going to do it Irish style. Like, don't waste your time. So it's, what am I really trying to achieve with my practice? I mean, who cares how flexible you are?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, who cares if, you climb trees, right? Who gives a fuck, But how does that affect you as a father or as a husband or, as an entrepreneur? That is maybe more aligned with your values than, it's fun to climb trees. It's good to have fun, but what else, And I think you already share this perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. This is right along the lines of the stuff that I'm kind of like, have been working on, very interested in. When I think I've been trying to frame this for a while, this idea of what is the why of practice. And I got really interested in play and started bringing in play because I thought that we had we had not identified the fundamental problem of our physical culture. The fundamental problem of physical culture is that nobody's motivated to do it.
Mm.
Right. So everyone's trying to find a better way to get people to have abs and to burn fat faster. But it really doesn't matter whether people can do long, slow distance running or HIIT. It's like the biggest thing is that if you ask most people to do either of those for a sustained period of time, they'll fail to do it because they're not motivated.
Sure.
So then the fundamental problem is, how do you get people to have motivation? And then my answer to that question was, well, people already have this inherent motivation for movement. It's called play, and it's built into children, but we kill it as a culture. And so I brought that in, and that has been a huge realization. But I felt like what I was doing with my practice wasn't precisely play. Play was a major component of it, but wasn't quite big enough to capture what I was doing. And it didn't quite lead me where I was going, if that makes sense. And so I ran into to Jordan Peterson's work, and I started to recognize that really the thing that we're motivated by maybe most is a sense of a personal heroic journey.
Mm-hmm. Meaning. Yeah.
And the quest for meaning. And so I've started telling this story about, like, I tell the story of the Dragon Slayer, St. George and the Dragon, at the end of my the first day of my seminars. And it's like, I think about it sometimes and I'm like, this is just weird and hokey. Like why am I telling this old fairy tale at the end of the seminar?
Patron saint of England and Russia. So I'm up for it.
But every time I tell the story and I break down what it means, it's like people's eyes start shining, and they're just like beaming back at you. It's like a human being is a thing that needs to be aimed towards something.
Mm.
And when you give them an opportunity to explore their why and give them a structure towards what a why might be, that's so much more powerful than the what of practice. So that's been what I've been discovering. And when you talk about this, kind of like, I think of movement practice as a laboratory for character. It's a concentrated way of exposing yourself to problems so that you can learn how you internally respond to them and start to shift that a little bit so that the rest of your life is easier to navigate. So you got a better understanding of the thing that you are and how to steer it through the world.
Yeah. I mean, there's always a definition of a practice, as I would see it. I mean, we're all unconsciously embodied, so we're all unconsciously practicing, but then a conscious practice, to create a conscious embodiment is like, okay, this concentrated place that doesn't matter, where there's no, I always say to my students, I do something called embodied yoga. I always say the great thing about yoga is it doesn't fucking matter. Like, who cares if you can stand on one leg? It doesn't matter. And also it's consequence free. If you're doing tree pose and you slightly fall, you fall over, well, you don't die, you don't lose your job, you don't lose your wife or your kids. Mm-hmm. So this place where you can control at least some of the variables, and then, there may be an element of risk in there too, but where there's some controlled variables, a concentrated place where you can work on yourself. In Japanese, this is the dojo. Yeah. And, there's the martial arts dojo, but there's also the flower arranging dojo. There's all sorts of dojos in Japan in terms of places where you work on yourself. So this concept has been around a while, and I feel like outdoor education and extreme sports have kind of reinvented it from a kind of Western point of view. And I would love to see the kind of Western movement culture that's developing get enriched in this way, That's why I've reached out to like Chandler and you and a bunch of other people in this field, because I just saw really good potential for cross-fertilization there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So one thing that comes up for me is right away is kung fu, right? Gung fu, kung fu. It doesn't mean martial arts, right? We associate it with kicking and punching, but as far as I understand, the fundamental meaning is something like good work.
Yeah, the kung fu, you should never have your steak kung fu. Well done. So it's a crime against humanity right there. But there's other definitions of it, and you could really go into the characters and things like that, but I'm not an Oriental scholar. But continuous work would be another kind of way of looking at it. This idea of working with ourselves. And I think the idea of sort of work and play, form and freedom, structural embodied practice versus play is really helpful. So I was just teaching in Moscow, and we have a course for facilitators, and I want to show them the spread of embodied work. And we have an evening session, which is 3 hours, I think. And for the first part, they're outside barefoot in the snow doing Japanese weapons. And if they make any mistake, they're thrown off the session. I shout at them. There's consent, and they understand what they're getting into. We just do sword cuts until it really hurts, and then we keep going some more. And that's the kind of Japanese martial arts training I had. And I want to give these students at least a taste of it, because there's a huge amount to be learned through sort of self-regulation and discipline and structure and order. And then we take a 15-minute break after we've done that. And they hate me by this point. And then we go upstairs into the warm, and we do a play session, and we do something called original play by a guy called Fred Donaldson, who was an Aikido teacher who played with wolves and autistic children. And we just roll around on the floor like kittens, and we're playing, and it's silly, and it's completely free, and we're just going with the flow and connecting, and it's deliberately pointless activity, which I think is fantastic in a world full of goal orientation as well, sometimes as well, right? Just to play, because as you say, that's pretty lacking in most Western cultures, particularly sort of North European and East European cultures. And the contrast between these two activities is huge. And the reason I kind of do this on the course is to show people some of the breadth of embodied training, but also to say like, hey, what do you need? Right? Like the problem is that most people are practicing according to their neurosis, not according to their development. So most people that need discipline are already doing the contact dance and the fire rhythms and all the crazy, running around the woods, whatever. And then the people that are already like a little bit fucking uptight are doing the martial arts and the structure, the Iyengar yoga and the structure stuff. And, I've got an Iyengar yoga teacher student in Moscow as well. And I'm always messing with her. I'll take her mat and just make it slightly off center, and she has to practice for like the next day with this mat that's not quite straight, and it freaks her out. So there's so many ways to practice. And the practice I've given her is to be just a bit more free and feeling in her yoga, but someone else needs the opposite. So that's part of all these disciplines. Maybe we can return to that question. These sort of 6 main fields coming together is realizing what they all bring to the party. What the Japanese, and in the same way as movement culture is seeing the different movements. Ashtanga yoga ain't enough in terms of movement. There's certain movements it lacks, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the same psychologically. So Ashtanga yoga is going to be great in one way psychologically, but not in another.
Yeah, absolutely. So, why don't we go into those 6 kind of primary fields from which this embodiment field develops?
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of argue it. And as I said, like you could do anything in an embodied way, but historically, there was kind of a collision really starting, there was prototypes in Central Europe, but really in the 60s, places like Ezeland, more your side of the world, there was these collisions of these fields. So there was the martial arts, the Asian martial arts, and, you could spend a whole lifetime just studying that, right? Aikido particularly has been influential because of certain elements of Aikido practice particularly led itself to that. And then there's also the bodywork arts. So, sort of original embodied arts, some of the old school ones like Feldenkrais, which is still a work of genius in my view, Alexander technique, any kind of somatic body work. So any form of massage which isn't just doing to the body, but it's doing with the body. Yeah. So there's the body work, the second one. Third one, we could look at yoga and meditation. And we could say all embodiment is mindfulness based, so it's mindfulness plus something. So that again is a huge field, right? And then we have acting and improv. So there's a really rich tradition coming out of Eastern Europe, Western Europe, of acting and method acting, of not just pretending, but actually becoming the character. Several of my colleagues, two of my closest colleagues are fairly developed actors. One works in plays, she's been in various Hollywood movies. And she talks about how disturbing it is to act well, to be a murderer or to be a molester or something outside of our normal range of experience if you're doing it from a fully embodied point of view. So there's a lot in acting and improv. Improv comedy is huge in terms of what that can teach you. And then we have dance, right? And we could split that into the conscious dance, like the 5 rhythms, the movement medicine, and then the partner dance. So the tango, the salsa. And again, you're going to learn something different. When I was doing Aikido, and it was fantastic for many years, full-time Aikido student, and I turned to a tango class, and there's women in beautiful shoes, and there's music, and there's perfume, and there's flirting, and I'm like, what the fuck is this? This is out of my realm of expertise as the sort of young macho martial artist, and there's polarity, and there's, musicality, and there's just things that just don't matter in Aikido. And that was fantastic, and my world opens, coming to that with an embodied perspective, which is often not the case. It's often just, done as a physical form. So we have dance, both the conscious dance, the free dance, and then the partner dance. Let's see, where have we got to? So we've got dance, body work, martial arts, meditation, yoga, improv and theater. What am I forgetting?
Psychology.
Oh yeah, so thank you very much. So we've got body therapy, which comes from sort of Reich and this tradition of psychologists who went suddenly, oh, what do you mean? There's it's not just a head on the stick. There was a psychologist and psychiatrist who suddenly realized the body was important. And then combined with them, you've got the dance movement therapists who were dancers who suddenly realized they were doing psychology. And this is really a sort of Central European tradition. A lot of people coming out of Germany and fleeing the Nazis. Actually, there's some prototype hippies in Germany as well who fled the Nazis and ended up in California. So it's their fault once again. So they're the main traditions. And what's really interesting is when you meet a teacher, because no one teacher can master these 6 disciplines. It's just more than a life's work. And even people who come close, like Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen or Paul Linden or Strozzi or Stuart Heller, like some of the people that I think have come close, and this is kind of one of my ambitions in life, which is probably impossible, would be to sort of have 10,000 hours plus experience in all of these domains. And even then you're scratching the surface, because it's like, okay, I got 10,000 hours of Aikido, but I've only got 1,000 of Jiu-Jitsu and 1,000 of kickboxing, It's very interesting because they all bias the embodiment practitioner towards a certain way of looking at the world. In terms of their emphasis, like an improv. When we have people on courses, and some of them are professional comedians and some of them are trauma therapists, and some of them are martial artists and they're used to seeing life as a fight, and some of them are life coaches and they're used to seeing things in terms of business success, and they're all coming together because there's this shared ground that the body matters to all of them. But it's fascinating to see their kind of biases and also what they bring to the party.
So I ran across something I really liked the other day, which was it's a quote from a Jeet Kune Do teacher, something like, "Know 5 martial arts, own 3 of them, and master 1 of them."
Nice. Yeah, there's only so many marriages you can have in a lifetime if you really want to get to know someone. Yeah. And I encourage my students to have 2 major perspectives, because if you just have one, you end up provincial.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit Mormon, Mormon marriage. So you have 2 major perspectives. One might be real expert. The other one is at least deep enough that you've got a sense of another point of view, and then be promiscuous with the rest. So that way you dig a kind of couple of deep wells. And if you're a professional in the embodiment field, I think, a couple is a good ask. Yeah. More than that's very hard. And one, as I said, tends to be provincial and limited. But then, try some other shit out. Like, you've never been to a jiu-jitsu class, go to a couple of classes, or do an 8-week course in tango. Like, a man should be well danced as well as well read. Like it ain't so hard to learn the basics of tango. You can do that in 8 weeks, you know? Like if you've never done martial arts, like all my yoga teachers, I'm like, right, do 6 months of kickboxing. Then you can be one of my instructors. Otherwise, you got a weird perspective. It ain't hard, you know, in most major cities to broaden one's horizon. We're incredibly lucky. I just think we're sitting at the feast of our lives. Like this is the 21st century embodiment feast. And actually the hard thing is how they integrate and fit together. And if I brought anything to this field, because I'm not the most deeply embodied person in the world, for example, not by far, but if I brought anything to this field, it's how they fit together, how they integrate, how you can be discerning, you know, for a particular person in a particular culture in a particular time, what they might need.
So can you go into kind of how you see that? How do you see the ideal kind of fit of these different pieces, or how would, obviously that's going to be variable, but how would somebody start to guide themselves through the process of identifying the pieces of embodiment that are most necessary for them? Great.
You ask such good questions. I really appreciate it because I have a podcast too, so it's nice. I mean, we coach people on this, and someone might have 4-hour-long coaching session plus reflections. So, you know, there's a process we could go through if someone was serious about it, but let's just make this useful for everyone. So what are your strengths is a good place to start, right? You know, ask around, get some unofficial 360 feedback, and look at strengths. And I look at this like it can be helpful to develop your strengths, but also to get to hygiene level with everything else. So maybe your strength is like, 2 of my strengths would be fierceness and playfulness. They're kind of Joker and warrior archetypes. And it might be really helpful for me to really develop those. So, you know, for example, I've done a lot of martial arts, and I'm looking at stand-up comedy as another sort of major practice over the next few years. To bring those two together to the fore, because I realize I've got strengths there and I get feedback on that. But then there's also the hygiene stuff. Like I'm a shitty listener, and yin practices of like letting go and not pushing too hard. You know, I'm going to do a 12-hour day again today, you know, work-wise. And I need to schedule massages, which is what I did today, and little yoga breaks and cuddles with my wife. And I need to sort of deliberately have a practice of being a bit more yin. So today I had an hour-long massage, and I've got 2 kind of 30-minute yin yoga breaks scheduled in my day to develop that letting go, that surrender, that soft side of myself, because otherwise that's going to fuck me. Like that's really going to, you know, I've seen, you know, I could get burnout, I can get too aggressive, I can get too pushy with myself and others. So for me, working to hygiene level is also important, as well as working with one's strengths. So that's the sort of logical way of doing it.
Yeah.
Another way to do it is just to fall in love. And I think like if you're newer to working with the body, the first thing is fall in love. You know, we don't decide our lives on Excel spreadsheets with data, and the same with embodied practices, you know? Like just fall in love with something is the first stage. And the second stage is to fall out of love, is after 10, usually 5 to 10 years. And anything less than that is complete beginner as far as I'm concerned. Like after 5 to 10 years, go, okay, what's limiting me here? And allow yourself to fall out in love with it without quitting, or without quitting permanently. I had a year off Aikido once, but I keep coming back to her. And without quitting permanently, but maybe take a year out or look at other things. You know, I got much more interested in like mixed martial arts, which was the other side of the spectrum. I did a year of sort of 5 hours a day of that. And that was what I needed to do to remove myself from the sort of provincial cul-de-sac of Aikido and learn another side of myself. You know, same with tango I mentioned before. So yeah, I think depends where you are on the staging, falling in and out of love, and then coming back to a mature relationship is a sort of third stage. That's the more kind of poetic, intuitive, emotional way of doing it as well.
Interesting. Yeah. I always tell people that like the first thing you need, like people tell me, I'd love to do parkour, I'd love to do this, I'd love to do that, but I need to get fit first.
Right.
I always tell people, you have to find something that gives you the motivation. You have to find the thing that you love. So the first priority in movement practice is find something that gets you out of bed in the morning to do it.
Yeah, yeah. It's Malcolm Gladwell. Love comes first, right? You don't do
Yeah.
10,000 hours, or I can dispute this figure, but you don't. The obsession that, like, Aikido. I just didn't miss a class at university. I walked in the first day of university. This kind of depressed, suicidal, drug addict, drug selling kid, and all fucked up on many levels, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and looked at Aikido and just fell in love with it. And then I almost didn't miss a class for 3 years at university, despite some pretty wild things still going on, for a few years. And it was like the love came first, the sense of like, God, I need this. Like this is why I use these analogies of like falling in love, because it really is like that. I say, like, find something that turns you on, find something that excites you, find something that rocks your world. And then all this stuff I'm talking about, it's kind of later. Your audience are pretty sophisticated, so they're going to get a lot of this, I think. But if someone's like 16 or 18 or whatever, and they're just like, oh, I'm kind of curious about body and stuff, I'd be like, cool, just find something you enjoy, go for it. And had I been at another university, I think I might have taken up parkour, for example.
Yeah.
Had there been a group of people doing that at my university at that particular time in my life, when I was looking to delve into something and get an education beyond books, which was, third generation teacher. I'd grown up with this lie that information is what matters, and that Wikipedia hasn't solved the world's problems is the joke I make. But I'd grown up with this idea that it was just information, and that had left me in a bad place. And I went, well, there's got to be another way to be smart. And at that point, I was ripe. I was fucking ready. And that's when I discovered Aikido. But it could have been parkour. It could have been my best friend at university was a caver. She used to go down caves, and kind of do this crazy practice. And it was like, okay, I could understand her doing that. She just fell in with a different group or whatever. And Aikido was just the thing that intuitively appealed to me. So, that's the first stage, isn't it? It's just fall in love, have fun, get obsessed with something, like let it take you to the end of where it will take you. And for me, that was living martial arts, living Aikido studies, going around the world with some of the masters of sort of psychology of Aikido, which was my particular sort of niche within that. That took me to a certain point, and then the learning curve slows right down. And that's the point where you need to fall out of love and let go of the sort of ego and attachment of there's this thing that I'm now quite good at, because by 30, I was pretty good for a young Aikidoka. I could go to any sort of Aikido school in the world and not look silly.
Yeah.
And there's ego with that, there's attachment, but then the sort of truth-seeking side of me, the heroic side, you might say, was saying, yeah, but what else is there? There's got to be other ways to grow.
Yeah, I think of there being sort of two main traps in movement practice. The first trap is the trap of stopping when it's hard.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of talented athletes who things come easily to, and whatever they're doing, as soon as it gets hard, they just move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so these guys who are like, B-level surfers, B-level grapplers, B-level, but they don't have they're not A's at anything.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the other side, which is once you're good at one thing, being afraid to suck again at everything else.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I mean, back to the marriage analogy, this is the people that get divorced every time the marriage is hard, or the first argument with their girlfriend, even before that stage, without getting to the depths of it, digging the deep well to get the really good water, and and then there's also the people that are in a marriage and they really should fucking leave, destroying them, but they're like, oh, I don't want to go back to dating again. That's really hard. I'm really comfortable where I am. Mm-hmm. So I definitely see both of those in all the different arts. And I'm, the fascinating thing in my world is I'm seeing such diverse groups of people. So like, I was just in Moscow, right? I was there for 3 weeks. It's pretty representative of the work I do. I spent the first 3 days in a telecoms company, one of the big mobile phone operators, sort of high paying job, corporate, fast track executives. And then the next day I got paid maybe 1% of the amount doing a workshop with the gay community there, traumatized gay community. So the first workshop was on leadership. Next one was actually on money. Often alternative communities have issues around money because of identifying with basically losers. And then the next day was yoga teachers. And they're all, drinking green smoothies and being yoga teachers. And the next day, psychologists. and they're all asking about each other's parents, and they're tremendously complicated. And the next day I'm at the university and I'm flirting with 200 students at the psychology department, and they're different again because they're young, so they're post-communist, so they've almost got a different culture. And this is a pretty, missing a few things out, but this is a pretty average couple of weeks for me in terms of very diverse groups of people. And on my courses, you know, there's people from all these 6 areas that I mentioned, plus a lot of coaches and business trainers. You know, we have movement people, kung fu teachers, comedians, psychotherapists, you know, and no one's good at everything. So it's always humbling. And when we deliberately help people establish a practice, we don't tell them what to do, but we always encourage that they establish a practice which is completely out of their comfort zone. So the tough martial artists we send to salsa dancing, and the salsa dancers we send to martial arts, you know. And that's fascinating because you also start to see the patterns, like how teachable they are, or which group are likely to have relationship problems, or how they relate to things like doing their homework. Like we have a course manager, and she knows that the free dancers are always going to be a pain in the ass to kind of do their homework because they're, you know, lacking the sort of structures and boundaries quite often.
So I want to back up and ask a question about the falling in love thing, because I think it's really key. And I think that that may be more difficult than you and I realize, right? Like when I started parkour, it was the first thing I thought about in the morning. It was the last thing I thought about at night. Like it was literally like the same as when I fell in love with my wife. Like
got it.
And I also like I got to the point where I sort of needed to widen my practice, needed to go back to these other things. So I totally identify with that. But then I've also recognized that for some people that doesn't seem to happen. You know, they go from thing to thing, and there's nothing that obviously becomes their thing.
Yeah.
And so if you've tried a variety of things and there isn't that immediate connection and obsession,
yeah,
how do you choose a practice? Because I think fundamentally, like I was reading Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning. He's talking, and he's quoting Nietzsche, and Nietzsche was talking about how, like, to become free in a way, you have to like deeply cultivate one thing. You have to enslave yourself. You have to be obedient to a principle. And it's only when you've done that for a long time that you've cultivated yourself enough that you can let it go and become free.
Yeah.
So I think that stage is so critical to gaining the most benefit from all these practices. And then the question is, okay, well, for you and I may have found that thing may have just clocked us upside the head and said, hey, here I am. How does someone who doesn't have that experience find an experience that will work for them?
Yeah, I mean, the arranged marriage is a pretty good option too. You know, like, I mean, I could go different ways with this. First of all, Nietzsche, one of the original embodied philosophers, he talked to the body as self. That was, you know, almost his idea, like pre-Freud, and various other philosophers coming out from him, phenomenologists and the like. But anyway, part of me is like, you know, why the fuck aren't you in love with something? Like, why don't you have that passion? But then there's equally, like, passion exists as an embodied phenomenon. So the more disembodied people become, the less passionate they are. So there's a vicious circle here. And I've coached a lot of people on like life purpose and what they want to do with their life. And embodiment's part of that as well. When you start to tune into what brings you alive, right? Like that radar is broken in a lot of people. Mm-hmm. For starters, disembodiment creates a break in that radar of meaning. So that's, you know, people talk about meaning like it was just obvious to everyone. It's not obvious to everyone. Most people are walking around dead from the, you know, the neck down and gray, and as a result, not finding that love and that joy, you know. So I feel like that's one way to look at it. But I think there are people who are more generalists, and I've seen this in life purpose work, that there are some people who genuinely aren't quite as, you know, if I was to be unfair to us, we were a bit autistic or something maybe. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, really obsessing like train spotters about something. There's something quite male in that, I'd say, as well, at the risk of upsetting people out there. The risk of upsetting Kathy Newman. That ability to just, you know, in a way that most women are just too healthy and balanced to get that obsessed. I remember, you know, I used to be sitting in a pub and I'd be like practicing a wrist lock on myself. You know, it was weird, you know? And I think there are healthier ways to do it. And the arranged marriage analogy here is that you can fall in love with something over a bit of time. It isn't always love at first sight, right? Like there are practices that I've done because I felt like I should, or because I'm an embodiment trainer and I kind of wanted to round out my CV. And, you know, like, and then after a while, I was like, I remember the first time I choked someone out in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I was like, hang on a minute, that was fucking fun. You know, there's me thinking I'm too spiritual to be competitive, and actually it's fucking awesome. So, you know, that wasn't love at first sight. That took me a while. You know, that was 2 or 3 months of just getting fucking tapped out by everyone. And then I kind of not only discovered that I could win the odd game, but it was also the match, but it was also that I found my own competitive side, which I'd kind of repressed through 10 years of Aikido previous. So that was a kind of almost arranged marriage, because I thought it was something I sort of should do in some ways, you know. Yeah, so I feel like it is possible to come at it other ways. And I think there's always a danger in anything when people have had some success where they go, well, this is the way for everyone, all right? Because this is what worked for me. So the obsession route is one way to go. And it's also lifetime, right? Like me and you, we have commitments now. So someone coming to me at 40 with a business and kids and a wife, that's real different from someone who's 18. And I'm like, you know, go to the Shaolin temple.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's a very different, thick kind of commitment they can make at 18. I'm like, you know, or you just finished university, 21 years old. It's like, okay, run away with the circus. Like I lived with the circus in Ethiopia. I lived in Aikido dojos. Just spent a lot of years in my 20s just getting drunk and, you know, meeting interesting people. And do you know what I mean? Like now that's not the kind of thing I've got time for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was kind of what I was thinking when I was listening to us talk about that falling in love process. It was like, that's a lot easier when you're a young person. And I feel like it is, as you mentioned, I think that happens more for men than for women. Like there's certainly women who have that same experience, but I feel like I see that kind of obsessive falling in love with a practice more from young men.
It's risk taking as well. I mean, there is some pretty, without again upsetting anyone too much, there is pretty good evidence in terms of young men's risk taking. You know, in terms of we're genetically disposable, right? And the testosterone levels. You know, if you give testosterone to rats, they start fighting each other.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty antisocial drug, you know. And I think some of that risk taking that is associated with young men is necessary to be like, okay, I'm going to go to the Shaolin temple. It's not necessarily a logically smart move to do. To just say fuck it, you know. And I think certainly working with social shame is quite an interesting factor here. I was very lucky. I had an alcoholic dad, so in the village, and what that meant was at quite a young age, my sort of sense of social shame just got kind of turned off.
Yeah.
I just went, okay, screw what other people think. And that's fantastic for sort of really following your passion, following your bliss, or following your heartbreak, as someone else says, which I think is a much nicer way of putting it. If there isn't that sense of sort of social conformity in quite the same way. And there's something about being stupid as well. There's something about actually being unreasonable. There's a great video of the first, I think it was American, to train with the Japanese in judo in the 60s for the Olympics. And he had a Japanese trainer, and it was just as Japan was sort of opening up after World War II, early 60s. And he said, our trainer asked the unreasonable, you know, like 2,000 push-ups before you even start training. And there's something in, you know, being willing to surrender to that. Like, it's like climbing Mount Everest. You know, I stayed in one dojo, which was, you know, like, I mean, it was the teachers, it was like having a tiger just throw you around. It was dangerous and unreasonable. And now I wouldn't do that. I'd actually regard it abusive, actually, now. I'd advise against it in some ways. But there was a time in my life where that unreasonable throwing oneself into something has its benefits, you know. So I went to war zones. That was another thing that I felt compelled to do, and tested a lot of the kind of theories I'd learned really on the sharp edge of life. And I'm so glad that I have done that, as I'm now approaching 40. And I ain't going to put my wife and, you know, my mom and all the rest of my niece and all the rest of my family through that shit again. Yeah. So maybe it is stages of life as well. I'm just thinking out loud here. So
no, it's interesting because, you know, you and I were in the business of basically trying to capture the benefit of these practices and these lifestyle decisions that we've made that maybe most people aren't going to have the opportunity to make.
Yeah, there's some people going to hell to steal fire from the gods, right?
Yeah.
That's okay. And I can teach a business person a basic centering technique from Aikido, and they can apply it, practice it once a day when they open their email, and they'll still get a lot of benefit from that. And that's okay. I think the real pros in this field should have gone to the edges, and they should have suffered and had the obsession and the love and all those things if someone's setting themselves up as a pro in this field. But certainly you do not need that to benefit from this, which I've seen time and time again with every group imaginable. I've deliberately found the hardest groups to work with, who I thought would be least embodied and most resistant to this work, from politicians in the House of Lords to soldiers to, I don't know, single mums. I mean, every single group, every time I find a new group, I'm like, yes, great, I'm happy. But for a few years, it was like my mission to sort of take embodied work to the groups that people said I couldn't work with. Just because I'm stubborn and bloody minded and was a young man trying to prove a point. But what I saw time and time again is that these simple things people really can benefit from. So you don't need to do all this extreme stuff.
Yeah. So I wanted to loop back to the social shame element, because like going back to this idea that we're trying to extract the benefit of our experiences and then give it to people who don't necessarily have the same psychology, don't necessarily have the same life stage where this stuff entered into their life. And so we have to be able to like recognize where our narrative doesn't help us understand the people that we're working with.
Yeah. And
so we're talking a little bit about the idea of, this obsessive style being kind of yang. It's a young male thing. And then you brought up the idea of social shame. And this is something that I think, like parkour is a discipline that is really predominantly male right now. And one of the things that I think has driven that is that it involves potentially looking really stupid in front of large groups of people in public.
I was just doing a photo shoot in Moscow, and it was with various students of mine doing embodied yoga poses in really public places. Mm-hmm. And some of them look quite silly if you don't know what you're looking at. Yeah. And because they're sort of archetypal shapes, so they're by definition quite extreme psychologically. Yeah. And it was quite interesting to notice the difference between the students, and there was a gender difference in terms of, and Russian culture is quite interested in what other people think of you, because, the fucking KGB would get rid of you if your neighbors reported you, right? There's a history to that. There's some dark history to it. But, there's also this almost Asian sort of Chinese view of face and what other people think of you. But I did see a gender difference amongst the students in terms of how silly people were prepared to look. Yeah.
So, like, it seems to me that most of the guys who started parkour, most of the early adopters, were people who basically could like do something, land on their face in a public space and laugh it off and have like zero social, like psychological damage from the fact that some stranger may be laughing at them. And I think this has been one of the things that has made it harder for women to enter it, because I think that possibly both like on a temperamental level and on a cultural level, that's less, it works less for them. And then you have these like add-on effects where it's like, once that culture is the culture of the discipline, then it gets harder for someone to enter it who doesn't have that culture. So your work is, you work in an area where we're like predominantly female, right? Most of these kind of embodiment things seem to be maybe a little bit more on the feminine side, or attracted more to the female.
So we had a weird thing this year that hardly any men signed up for courses, which hasn't been my career arc, because I tend to have a fairly yang style, which men like on the whole. In different countries, it's different. So if I teach Russian yoga teachers, we're looking at 95% female. Okay. If I teach life coaches, business coaches, we might be 60 to 70% female. But I mean, in the Russian telecoms company, I was working with 80% men. Okay. So it really depends which group I'm working with. But I'd say in the field, it also depends on the embodied practice. Like, there's way more male sort of Tai Chi, Qigong, martial arts teachers, but dance movement therapy is super female. Yeah. But these different fields have different gender biases, I'd say, depending on the nature of the embodied practice. Though, traditionally the sort of sexism has been that body is female. and intellect is male. That's been the traditional sort of split, right? In terms of the body mind split, that itself has been somewhat gendered. And there are different pressures, and I think, to be fair to women, in terms of like the pressures on the body, they are different. And well, in some ways they may be evening out in a bad way. The sort of pressures on women to look good, and they're being judged on that, is still huge. So I do want to kind of acknowledge that, to be fair.
Yeah, I was talking to one of my female friends, who Caitlin Pentrella, who I'm going to try to have on the podcast soon. She was talking about, like, you know, just being uncomfortable doing quadrupedal movement in public because of the sexualization of that position, the way that someone's going to perceive her. Like, as a man, being bent over on your hands and knees, it doesn't scream sexualization in the same way, or we don't perceive ourselves as potentially objectifiable in the same way as women. But I was particularly interested in asking you this question because it's a question that's very interesting to me, and I felt like there might be a very interesting perspective from the embodiment point of view, and someone who's worked maybe a lot more with women, about how do we cultivate somebody who has that sense of social shame to be able to take on these practices and develop that deep love and ability to go into the obsessive phase.
Let me broaden the question. Can I broaden the question a little bit? So I wrote a little ebook for my students called How to Work in Business, a Guide for Hippies. Yeah. It's really a guide for anyone from alternative cultures, whether it's parkour or martial arts or meditation or yoga, working with mainstream cultures, whether it's business or mainstream education or politicians or military or whatever. And there's a whole world, I could say, about language and the purpose of using aims and how you dress. I mean, there's a whole structure for that, right? Like, we've been talking a little bit about business recently, me and you, and there's a whole art to that, because most of us who are deep in body arts, male or female, are fucking weird. And we think differently, we dress differently, we talk in weird ways, you know? And like, that is a whole training for people I work with. And then this sort of being willing to do the unusual. I mean, I'm always actually quite touched when I have, say, business people in a workshop, because it takes a lot of vulnerability, you know, to do that for them. And there's an art to making it feel safe for them and setting it up and introducing it gradually and calibrating that right as to what's too much, what's too little, you know. That's really the art of this. And that's a lot of what I'm teaching. Like, when people come to me who are already body people, that's a lot of what I'm teaching them, is how to. I'm a pretty good translator, I would say. You know, I'm pretty good at taking this to groups that might otherwise, you know, a room full of the police, for example. You know, I taught some of the top police in London, and there's a policewoman there who's responsible for all the armed response units, you know, in the UK. So some pretty heavy hitting people that might have quite conservative views, which back when I was more liberal was challenging kind of politically. But also it's a practice, right? Like, any of my friends, even, let alone students who spend any time with me, they soon learn to desensitize to social shaming, because I'm just doing stupid shit all the time. And like, they realize, like, you know, I don't know, like, a great practice would be like complimenting beautiful women, just respectfully and with consideration for the context, etc. Learn to compliment beautiful women, because that's fucking terrifying for most men. And, you know, even who just, it can be an old lady, right? You don't even have to be going anywhere with it, but just be like, oh, you know, excuse me, I hope you don't mind me saying, I thought you looked absolutely lovely. Tell something sincere, something real from the heart. Have a lovely day. Goodbye. So that's a practice I might give to a student to do, simply to desensitize them to what other people think. And, you know, doing that in public, doing that in crowded places is even more challenging, but like, that's a practice. That's something you can get better at. And what you quickly realize is, oh, look, I didn't die. I didn't get ejected from the cave. In fact, the girl smiled and wished me a nice day, and it seemed to make her happy. Do you know what I mean? Like, 9 times out of 10. So it's like, this practices like that you can actually give students to gradually, like you would practice weightlifting. I mean, all these things are practices, right? So it's like, how do you get better at weightlifting? Well, you find a weight which isn't too heavy and isn't too light, and then you lift that and you do some reps, then you rest and you integrate, and then you keep doing that, and then you increase the weight or the reps, right? Mm-hmm. So that's same, or how do you learn a language, right? Same basic principle of practice could apply to this kind of desensitization of realizing it's not the end of the world if you do something sort of socially unusual or whatever.
Yeah. So, I think there's a missing piece there, which is how to make somebody, or let's not say make somebody, how to present it for somebody in a way that's relevant to them, right? Like once someone decides that lifting something heavier is relevant, then the linear progression of like putting more weight on the bar is actually really simple. But for a lot of people, realizing that a heavier weight on the bar is actually aligned with their goals is the problem.
Yeah, and this is what you did with the podcast. You asked me this question of like, why should my listeners be interested in this? You know, and that's the reason I deliberately came back to that question in the podcast, because I want, you know, you guys out there listening to speak directly to you, to be like, at least have the potential to be motivated to listen to this and to listen well, you know, to listen with intention to learn or to take something from it. And that's hard when the people aren't in the room, right? I'm just kind of guessing. And I tend to know the kind of things that might motivate different groups. So with business groups, it might be, you know, effectiveness, or with the HR manager, it might be looking at churn rate, you know, employee engagement, return on investment. I've learned all the buzzwords from my subscription to HR magazine, which I took 10 years ago to learn all the buzzwords. You know, like I learned the language as if I'm learning Russian, which is what I'm doing now. You know, it's like also listen, it's like, what motivates people? Like, what are you interested in here, you know? So I feel like that's part of the process, and a key part which I teach my students is, why are we doing this? Because they say the business people I work with, they'll do some crazy shit, they'll do some out there Californian tree hugging craziness if there's a good reason, and if there isn't, they won't do shit. And you can't assume that just because they're in the room, right? Like, you know, who sent them there? How did they get there? We were talking about this the other day, right? It's like the HR manager might have employed me to increase employee engagement, but they don't care about that. What they care about is not, shouting at their wife. You know, they care about getting home in time to see their kids or whatever, right? So this, you know, getting that buy-in, that investment, I think that's primary to anything. That the other one is, I'd say, is being really clear on the method. So a lot of people from alternative backgrounds will speak in metaphors or outcomes. So they won't give clear what Paul Linden, one of my teachers, calls operational language. So they won't say, pay attention to the sensations of breathing as air goes in and out of your nose. They'll say, empty your mind, for example, the worst meditation instruction in the history of the world. And like, that's a potential outcome or kind of a metaphor. It's not a specific instruction. So when people have a why and a specific how, it's not really a problem, you know, assuming you're not dressing outlandishly or doing whatever. Even that you can get away with after a while. But I'd say that why and that how is a sort of key place to start. And there's no excuse not to have that in any field, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's something triggered me in that about an idea that's obviously big in the yoga community, which is the idea of alignment. And I had a conversation recently with a friend of mine, Stefan Bigru, who's one of the top parkour teachers, who's one of David Bell's students. And we're talking about like the necessity of being really deeply aligned with what you're attempting and where you're trying to go when you're doing things where you might die. So like there's an embodied sensation of, this is right for me. And my motivation is for me. And when you're in that place, then you can do jumps where you might die. And if you're not in that place, you really need to not do it. And classically, like when guys get injured in parkour, it's always because they let something else other than their own embodied sensation of the connection to the jump drive the jump, right? So you're there. My friend Dylan Baker, he almost died doing a Kong to cat, like 300 feet off the ground. And he basically did it because he had asked his friends to come up there and film him.
Yeah.
And he felt like pressure to perform up to the expectations of the group. Like he had
this, or my mind tells me I should do this, like I did this last week, even though this week is different, or I'm showing off or whatever. So there's an external driver rather than an intuitive, embodied, felt sense of it, right?
Exactly. So this came up to ask you about, because I think this is such a fundamental thing about movement practice, but it's also the fundamental thing about, like, that's really what you're looking for in life, is that how can I be better at getting myself in that place where I feel like my why, my how, my what, they're all aligned effectively in the direction that I'm going.
Yeah.
And that's a felt experience. It's an embodied experience. It's not a thing that you can extract and write on down on a page perfectly. It's something that you have to feel. So I'm curious how you look at the cultivation of that, how you see that in the students, and get yourself set up so that what you're trying to do with them helps them be aligned with it. If that makes sense?
Yeah, and it's body awareness based skill, like all body awareness based, right? Like, from am I hungry or am I overeating because I'm, that's emotionally driven. That's what I was working on a lot at the end of last year. It's kind of blind spot for me. That's one very practical level, right up. We talked about falling in love, right? Nobody works that out on an Excel spreadsheet with data. That's intuitive. Like you fucking know this already. And then we've got life purpose. And I'm really fine-tuned to life purpose stuff now. It's not just like, oh, I'm an embodiment teacher. It's like, for who, when, how, where. Yeah. And I'm really constantly feeling into is there a rightness to this job? And the ultimate is where there's this kind of flow state where I'm, I had one beautiful embodied yoga session in Moscow where it's just timeless. And the interpreter, the translator, she actually got caught up with it, and she'd never had it before in her life. And at the end of the session, she said, what just happened? Where did the time go? She'd done 10 sessions with me before, 10 classes, but she said that was different, So that's the sort of ultimate end of it. And I haven't found a way to be there all the time for sure. But even at it might sound a bit abstract. So, I mean, even at the low end of just am I hungry right now? Or one for me is just do I need to rest? Am I overworking? Like that tuning into the body. And just because someone's athletic doesn't mean they have that. In fact, potentially the opposite. If you're treating your body as a performance machine, that's disembodying. So some of the hardest people I've trained are dancers, for example, professional dancers, or Olympic athletes who have just dissociated from their bodies because it's always in pain. So yeah, just because someone can do a big jump or do a good roundhouse kick or whatever, doesn't mean they have that tuning in. And increasingly, I'm just coming back to the simplicity of it. I mean, there's extreme states and extreme practices and these all things, but, it's just on a daily basis being like, okay, how am I now? Or what wants to happen in this conversation now? Am I listening or speaking? What's the felt sense of that? So yeah, kind of the simplicity on the other side of all the embodiment training complexity is what I'm most interested in at the moment.
What do you pay attention to? If we're thinking of a human being as much the body as the mind, and you're looking at a group of students and you're trying to find the way to move them that's relevant to them and relevant to their goals, what is the thing that you're cueing off of to see in their body that they're embodying the experience effectively?
Yeah, I mean, Jordan Peterson talks this thing about the truth makes you stronger. Well, that's literally true. I mean, Paul Linden does tests on this. They're kind of he has people kind of lie and then tries and pushes them over and then tell the truth and you can't push them over. Yeah. So that's very literal. And you can find this on YouTube if you're interested. So this, in terms of being stronger, I think that's a key one. But in terms of practices for beginners, it's okay, do a year of body-based meditation. So breath-based meditation is fantastic because the breath is one of the most sensitive indicators. And, if I'm holding my breath, that says something to me, right? As opposed to the fluid movement. And it might be the kind of good anxiety of oh shit, because there is a way in which when you're on a date with the woman who's going to be your wife, you should be scared. And that's okay, and then there's the in the wrong place feeling. And I think learning to differentiate those two is important, the sort of excitement from the anxiety. Partly some of this is an unconscious competence for me now, so it's hard to teach, but what I've found helps people is just increasing the level of body awareness through sitting practices for subtlety, movement practices for dynamism, which is more like life, and relational practices, because that's really like life. And you kind of need those three. And if someone has those three, a good sitting practice, could be standing, but still meditation practice, something like a yoga practice or a Tai Chi practice, and then something like could be Aikido or partner dance or some kind of relational practice, then they're going to develop that skill. Does that answer your question? I feel like you're actually answering a better question than I've asked around this subject. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm just kind of, I'm flowing with it. And this aspect of being able to embody, and it's something that I'm paying attention to. Like, how do I listen better? That's another, you mentioned earlier that you feel like listening isn't your best skill. And I feel the same way. And I really like Jordan Peterson's chapter on listen as if the person you're speaking to knows something you don't.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I imagine they've got a gun to my head, that works. Or, I'm a 16-year-old and I'm, back to, we're talking about love. It's a bit romantic today, I think, actually. Yeah. They're talking about the 16-year-olds in love, looking with that rapt attention. So I think there's different sort of ways into that. But certainly for me, the self-listening precedes that. I'm pretty good at that, and I'm learning to put it into more relational context. The self-listening is kind of a key part there. And a lot of meditation, I've done retreats, extended retreats, solitary retreats, monastic stays. It was very solitary, and there's something about bringing it into the relational, which is really needed and often lacking from a traditional sort of meditation point of view. Yeah. I've had martial artists who are very calm, but as soon as it gets conversational, they can't handle it because they haven't actually transferred their skills even from the relational domain, let's say the jiu-jitsu people, into the conversational domain. Or, can they take a compliment? So there's some bridges that are needed to take it into sort of, romantic or social or conversational kind of components as well. Those bridges can be made pretty quick once people already have the sort of base, say, self-regulation or self-expressive skills that they can learn just through the body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm big on this idea that body practices are incredibly educational for life if you do the work to transfer them.
Yeah, the transfer we talk about, the transfer skills is, I've invented this thing, Embodied Yoga Principles, and a lot of it is just adding some decent transfer skills to yoga. Because, otherwise, they are going to stay on the mat. I spent years working for an organization called Aikido Extensions, which takes Aikido off the mat. And I first worked it out with Aikido, and then I realized these principles could be used for yoga, or, my students do Kung Fu, or one does queer partner dancing, one of my students, it doesn't matter. Yeah. Once you understand the principles, this is why we talk about Embodied Yoga Principles or Embodied Principles, that you can transfer it into anything. But you do need to do that transfer. And I feel like integration or life transfer is usually the missing piece with most body practices. Yeah. And that's just done massively inefficiently. And one nice thing about business is they've really pushed me over the last 10 years they'd be like, right, you've got a day. In Russia, I had 40 people for a day and a half, 2 different groups of 40 people. It's like a day and a half, and I've got to turn them into embodied leaders, It's like, wow. I mean, some of that is just establishing motivation practice for future work, but it's also like, I want to give them something of real value, Yeah. They ain't got 3 years of live-in Aikido residential. And most embodied arts are tremendously inefficient in terms of actually improving your life. And there's things that can be done which increase that efficiency.
So the question that I'm going back to was, okay, we need to extract these lessons for our students, and then there's this felt knowledge within you that it's working or it's not working, right? And then the student has that same thing. There's this embodied sensation that tells you what's happening. And then there's the question, like, how do you as a teacher recognize that better? How do you develop like the heuristic set of, obviously this is something that you have to cultivate over time. But if you have someone who's new and you're trying to teach them to know whether they're connecting effectively with their students, what is the thing that they're paying attention to? Like, what do they look for to see that sense of alignment, that sense of embodied flow in their students?
I mean, I think there is an internal and fairly recognizable internal sense of rightness, we might say, in ourselves.
Yeah.
But there's also, this isn't just an intuitive feeling, there's also just data and feedback, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of what I do with business people is give them, I say, don't believe a word I say, and I give them experiences, and I'm like, oh, look, that worked better than that. Or, you came up with a completely different statement around this business problem, a completely different idea. So I feel like there is always data suggesting that. There's always like, wow, that was just 10 times better than what I thought of 1 minute ago. So people are sort of proving it for themselves and getting feedback that way as well. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm getting to the heart of what you're interested in here or not. You may have gone over my head with your cleverness once again.
No worries. Yeah, I think it's a question that occurs to me within this, just because it's something I'm really paying attention to in my own teaching. I'll give you maybe another angle on it, which is one thing I've noticed in teaching is my perception of how well the teaching is going is only partially based on the experience of my students. It's also partially about things that are internal to me. So I might like feel a little depressed, a little tired, like a little beat down because of stuff that's happening in my life. And I might be able to put on a class and have everybody in the class have an amazing time, but I don't know that they're having an amazing time because I'm not having an amazing time.
Sure. I mean, you're the tool you're sensing through, right? So that's part of the body perspective, is realizing, like, right now I haven't eaten in about 24 hours. I'm fasting today, right? But I'm aware of that as part of the lens through which I'm listening to you with now. Yeah.
And then on the flip side, if I like one thing that I play with and use as an energy in my teaching is I'll move while my students are moving. So it's an idea I got from Margaret Stryker, which is you shouldn't do too much demonstration because you can kind of feed too much information to the students and prevent them from organizing themselves. But what you should do is once your students are moving and you've given them a task, you can move with them and you can move on the outside so that they can basically pull energy and excitement and inspiration off of what you're doing.
Yeah, and there's a somatic crutch there as well. Just in, like, if I'm teaching a student centering, I'll stand real close to them and get real relaxed. And, their body is just mirroring mine. There's physiological basis for that. There's no magic involved. And then I'll gradually back off, and then eventually I'm standing the other side of the room. They're doing it for themselves. But, I've done some state transfer just through like proximity-based state transfer. And mirroring based transfer, so they can see me. I'm using my voice. I'm using all the different modalities that influence us from an embodiment point of view that a teacher has to work with. And I gradually remove those. So, that's definitely something I'm playing with. Maybe it's a different thing.
Yeah. I mean, it seems connected. Like how do you use your presence and your voice and how that embodies itself in the student. So
that's the kind of fourth, just if I may, where we've talked about 4 elements of embodied intelligence. I use Daniel Goleman's model of emotional intelligence to embodiment. Self-awareness is the basis. Self-regulation, we talked about being able to be centered, being able to regulate yourself. Listening, being able to be open and embodied listening, to notice the changes in your own body as a result of the other people. You can do that if you're relaxed. And then influence is the last one. As kind of come to the close here, we're actually kind of covered the full spectrum of how do we influence people, whether that's inspiring them or turning them on or elevating their mood or, calming them down. And, essentially embodiment's infectious, right? That's why when you go to another city, you feel different, because New York is not Hawaii. Like after a month in Israel, I'm coming back to England and just upsetting everyone because I'm kind of developed this fastness. We haven't talked much about culture. Americans are so culture blind. It's part of your culture. Like, I love talking about embodied culture, and like for me, that's just fascinating. Like, the culture is like the shared body, right? And it's the way in which it's infectious. And when you make a class, you're making a mini culture.
Yep. Yeah, I'm very obsessed with culture right now. That's probably too big of a black hole to go down. So
we'll tease people with that one then. Next podcast.
Embodied culture. Let's do it again. I wanted to ask you one more question that's kind of been on my mind throughout the podcast, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. There's broadly, it seems to me that within a practice, it can have an internal or an external focus, right? So you can be climbing a tree, and your focus can be, how does my body feel moving in this tree? Right?
Yeah.
What's happening to my emotional state as I move in this tree?
Yeah.
Like, are my shoulders getting loose? Is my connection between my different parts of my body moving? Or you can be focusing on, like, am I going faster? Am I getting here better? Is this movement connected better? Is am I not going to die when I do this big jump where I'm exposed at height? And it seems to me that body embodiment practices tend to be oriented towards internal focus.
There's an element of that, but if there's too much of that, it's weird and useless.
Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper. This is why I haven't really gone deep into like Feldenkrais or Somatics or Alexander or any of this stuff, is because I see people who seem to be getting so internally focused that.
Let me just tell you about my feelings. Like I'm sorry, I just need to stop a minute. Yeah. Sorry, let's continue. They get so internally focused, they become losers. They lose track of relationship. They don't achieve anything in life.
You said it, brother, not me.
I've upset all the hippies already, man. So let's just fucking go for it. Yeah, sure. That's the stage.
There's something that seems myopic to me, and like a lot of times, like if the focus is movement, they're not actually going anywhere with the movement, right? They're sort of infinitely changing small things about the way they experience and perceive a extremely low level expression of movement.
Yeah.
But you already highlighted the opposite of that, which is that when you're so focused on the external, then you can actually disembody from yourself. Your body becomes a machine that performs the things that you want to have done.
Yeah.
So there's this, and then we know and I think this is connected to something we know about cueing, right?
Yeah.
The science of cueing is basically that if I tell you to focus on jumping further or pushing the ground away harder, or, feel like when you hit a bag, bend the bag in half, like that's a cue that's going to increase power. If I tell you to like squeeze your glutes or focus on the way your scapula is moving, etc.
We orientate to goals, and if you orientate too much to the body, it's actually going to screw up your movement and socially also just make you weird. It's just kind of weird when you're talking to someone, all their attention's inside. But if there's a happy medium here, like even in this conversation, I'm tracking my own breath, my own mood, my energy. I'm kind of tracking, okay, I haven't eaten today. Is that going to fuck me up somehow? I'm kind of tracking my intuition and what's bringing me alive in the conversation. But mostly I'm paying attention to you, right? And some sense of the listener out there. And then there's a movement. So I might occasionally just touch back in on myself 100% or 99%, and then go out again much more. So I feel like the ability, if you're trapped in either the doing external or the internal feeling, I mean, neither of those are helpful if that's all you can do.
Yeah. And well, I guess there's two questions within that. One is, how does somebody who has external goals grab these internalized practices in a way that's going to transfer and that's not going to interfere? Because if you start thinking a lot about how you're breathing or how you're organizing your spine or how you're doing that, and those thoughts are trying to enter your mind as you're performing extremely high level intense skills, you will get yourself hurt, right? Like if you're in the middle of a complex course where you need to put your foot down on a branch.
Place to practice. I mean, a place to practice has to be safe enough, right? That you can learn a new skill. So if the new skill is increasing your kind of interoception, kind of emotional sense, intuitive sense, then the place to practice is on the low branches, right?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. What I've found personally within my own journey is that sometimes if I started focusing on internalized practices, I get a creep where the thoughts will occur where they're not optimal. Right? So you need to be able to divide your attentional focus or develop a strategy for attending to the right things in the right contexts. Does that make sense? And so I see a lot of people who come from these internal practices who are always talking about, you just need to pay attention to your breath. You need to do this. And it's like, you're going to die if you try to do this stuff that you do. Like if Anderson Silva is trying to punch you in the head and you're like, am I too afraid of him trying to punch me in the head? How do I emotionally accept that he's trying to punch me in the head? Like you're going to be knocked out before you address anything. And the same thing when you're jumping at height in a tree. It's like if you're worried about your breathing and you need to put your foot down on a branch that's an inch wide, it's like, you're fucked. So I see people who get stuck in this mentality of the internal practices. And the same thing, this is more for me, this came from like internal cueing from a strength and conditioning perspective, got in my way a lot as I got into this higher level movement practices. So it's a question that I'm thinking about. How do I, because I think that there's another tendency, which is if you're just focused on the external, right? Then we can just say, fuck, we'll never use the internal cues. But then maybe we miss the point, which was that the practice.
What are you trying to build, right? Like,
exactly.
Back to where we started from. Like, what's the point?
Exactly.
Like, get real good at jumping on branches or lifting weights or whatever, but how does that help your marriage? How does that help your parenting? How does that help your business, right? Your politics, whatever.
Yeah.
Like what are the skills you actually want to build? And I don't have any problem with anyone building any skills. I just say, I started Embodied Yoga Principles class. I'll say, what do you care about? And people will tell me. And then I'll say, let's do a yoga that works with that builds skills that help that. I always start with people's real values and concerns, And so, yeah, I think that's always the starting point to come back to. And sometimes there's the humility of coming down a branch until you kind of get the hang of it or whatever it is. So we're not far till being out of time. So I could do like another sort of 5-10 minutes max. And I'm just looking at the clock there. We started a bit later than we thought. So
yeah, it's
that's dying to talk about. I'd love to ask about. I mean, me and you, we can talk shit all day, can't we? We have these like epic conversations. I'm like wondering what's like most of service to the listener, or could be most kind of useful to everyone out there.
I was just thinking that we'd be closing up right here at 9:45. So I wanted to ask that last question because it was something that was kind of stuck on my mind. What's that?
Yeah, I could do another 10 minutes total.
Okay. Well, let's just kind of let's finish with this. If there's key takeaways that the from the outside, you're growing an interest in the movement culture and natural movement, and you're saying, man, these guys they're very aligned with embodiment, but there's something that they can do better that we can offer them. Mm-hmm. What would be the most basic place for people to start, or the biggest takeaways that the movement community could get from embodiment practice?
I first of all would say not necessarily even a skill, though there are skills which aren't widely taught in the movement world, from various embodied practices. But I'd say it's just a perspective, like what we've talked about today, because I kind of assume that most people out there are smart, they're practicing, they've got experiences, and having this perspective, and I'd love to, if you start a Facebook thread on this or whatever, we'll see, like just having this perspective next time they go training. Yeah. So it's like, take this, wherever you train, outside or in the gym or, kickboxing studio, whatever you do, take this perspective with you and just see what it changes. You're a big fan of discovery learning, right? Like we don't tell people do this, this, and this. So I would put it in that kind of format, assuming people have that intelligence and just giving them that credit and saying, okay, how does this change things for you? And I feel like the questions will open up and it will develop in that community. I don't want to come to it like arrogantly sort of saying, look, this is what you need to learn.
Yeah, that's a good one. So to just reiterate what we've said earlier, embodiment is a way of using physical practices to cultivate the mind-body connection better, so that our felt sense of ourself in the world and our capacity to do all the things that the body mind does can grow over time.
To learn about yourself, to become more aware of yourself as a person, which will happen long-term, slowly and accidentally through many practices anyway, right? But it takes some time. That's not your intention. You'll start noticing like, oh shit, I always pick these kind of partners to spar with. What's going on with me? I always like to win, or I always like to lose, whatever it is. So there's the awareness, and then there's, as you say, the development, which is the choice, which is like, okay, like how am I actually building skills that I can transfer into my life that are useful for my life, not just as a metaphor, like, oh, life's a bit like jiu-jitsu or whatever, but actually like, what are the concrete things that I can build and transfer, and what do I want to build? What matches my life and my values? That to me is just, that's the cathedral to build rather than the wall. And that just strikes me as it's so because there's so much diversity and range now in the kind of movement world, it's just so open and free for that why not enrich it? You don't lose anything, you know, like in fact, you're going to be more motivated to lift the weight. You know, you're probably going to get physically stronger. You know, we don't sacrifice all the health benefits, the movement benefits. So why not bring that perspective? And I think some people just will say, you know what, I'm just a mover, I don't care. But other people are going to be like, wow, this is opening up a whole new world, just having that as an inquiry.
Yeah.
And then they can learn the specific skills with the experts, and we can put them in touch with people. And, you know, like this is someone you might want to study with, or, you know, dance movement therapy brings in this perspective that you might not be aware of, or whatever.
Yeah. I think it's funny in a way that you say health, like it's somehow separate from embodiment.
As an emphasis. So health obviously is the basis of embodiment, but for example, in the yoga world, health is such an obsession. Yeah. I'm just like, you know, I don't really get ill. Like I get ill maximum one day a year. You know, from all my lifestyle facts, my life expectancy is pretty good. I've got loads of energy. You know, I can fuck my wife whenever I want. I can, you know, walk to the shops. I can dance. I can fight. I can play with my niece. I don't need any more health. I don't need a fucking six pack. You know, like not just aesthetically, but even health wise. And I know for some people that is a hell of a good place to start. But then it's like, okay, if I'm already pretty healthy by any definition that matters to me, why would I focus on that?
Yeah. Well, for me, it seems like you can't separate health from the embodied sense of yourself in the world. It's like if your VO2 max is great and, you know, your blood markers are all awesome and your body fat percentage is perfect and you walk around in a body that you feel disconnected from with an emotional state that's not fun for you, that feels drifting and aimless. Like, are you healthy?
Well, here's the thing. Do you, like, let's say health can lead to confidence, for example, right?
Yeah.
But do you want to aim at building your confidence, or do you want to aim at building your health to eventually build your confidence? You know, like, and it just seems like such a long way around to me. But I mean, I get what you're saying about health. I just think it's just such a fucking obsession that unless you're having health problems right now, why focus on that? Yeah,
it's not so much that I'm saying focus. I'm not saying focus on health. I'm saying that health without an embodied perspective is an incomplete paradigm.
Yeah, for sure. And if real health, it has that integrated emotional side to it as well, right?
Yeah.
Like your moods, your happiness, the fact that you're, you know, my one was I'd overwork, which was an embodied pattern. I then would reward myself with food, and kind of an addictive tendency around that. So is that a health issue? Yeah, it's about food. But is it holistic? Sure as fuck is. And if you want a solution to that, if you want to build that, you know, work with that, then I've gone from, you know, kind of like a good diet to all of a sudden this really rich holistic health practice that I can practice 3 times a day when I'm eating. Been obsessed with food today because I haven't eaten.
Yeah, no, it's all good. Yeah, no, I think that's incredibly valuable for people to look at their relationship with food as something more than just the amount of calories, right? It's like what's driving you behaviorally, and that's something you can take into everything. So maybe embodiment is this drive to study these things within yourself. And
yeah, so for me, food is now fascinating in a way it didn't used to be. And this is kind of a blind spot for me. You know, sex becomes interesting in a different way. And, you know, certainly martial arts is, you know, that was the first area that kind of opened up to me, this weird special area, as it were. But I also just think this is about, you know, I was talking at MSU and I was saying this is our birthright. This is like just about being fully human. This is about not being half dead. This is about just fully experiencing our life and our humanity, you know? So yeah, there's all these practical skills like, you know, expressing yourself to make you a better leader or more attractive to women. That's true. That's definitely something I could teach you. But then it's like, it's also just part of being alive and human to sort of shake off some of these sort of shackles of disembodiment that have come through various historical factors we don't have time to get into now, but like there's a rehumanizing process. And I'm really aware of this when I'm in the ex-communist countries because there's a lot of trauma and there's a lot of closing down of the body, the old, you know, Russians don't smile kind of thing. Well, there's a reason for that, you know, and to actually be able to be present to ourselves, which opens up an ethical domain as well. You know, we're essentially psychopaths if we're disembodied. There's you know, to be present, to be able to, like in this case, form a friendship, you know, or to get an idea across passionately, like that's the skills, but there's more than that. That's core to who and how I want to be.
Yeah, I mean, man, there's so many things we could go into about.
We did another 3 hours.
I know. We've got the culture aspect. We've got like machine civilization, and the fact that we're integrating in the world more and more via screens as we are right now, and how that disembodied does. You know, I was writing up the description for my big summer event, and like the key thing was like, we're disembodied. We're atomized and we're disconnected. And the thing that people crave more than anything is connection. It's connection to their body, connection to the environment, connection to other people, connection to animals. Like all those things are
disembodiment and connection almost synonymous, you know, like connection to self, other, planet. That's all an embodied phenomenon.
Yeah. And so that's fundamentally what I think is the primary benefit of what I'm doing. So it's really, it's great to be able to talk with somebody who's been thinking so deeply about this. So thank you very much. I think we're just about out of time. So I wanted to give you a chance to say, if people are interested in understanding more deeply about embodiment, if they want to work with you, where can they go, and how do they find more about you?
Tinder. No, not. So it depends what they want.
Swipe right.
If they're yogis, they should look up embodied yoga principles. Or if they're movement people that want to learn a kind of archetypal psychological language, that's one system that's all over YouTube and the internet. Teachers all over the world. If they're a coach or they're a body person who wants to work with business, the sort of working with normal people, they should look up embodied yoga principles. And, you know, if they're millennial scum that have Instagram, they should follow me, Mark Walsh, my Instagram. There's loads of free resources that I've put out there. There's like over 1,000 YouTube videos. Oh, and my podcast, the Embodiment podcast, if you don't mind me plugging that.
No, of course not.
That's just me interviewing kind of very interesting embodiment people from around the world. You were on there. That was a good one. We've got movement people on there. But if you want to kind of broaden the horizons of the kinds of people, I was just listening back to one with a Tai Chi guy that I just got launched last night. And I'm learning loads from it. You know, it's the conversations I want to have. And I suspect, and I invite, maybe me and you could do a workshop together one day. I feel like that could be super juicy and I'd learn a lot. And I think your guys would too.
Yeah. Let's make that happen. 2019. So we'll talk about that off the podcast. Mark, once again, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure, and I feel like we just barely scratched the surface, so we'll have to do it again.
Such a joy. I need to go right now. So that was really good stuff. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Cheers, mate. Bye-bye.
Bye.